Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about company sizes. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, what is your experience with small and medium-sized technology companies, and what obstacles do they encounter in sustaining their operations? How does the intricacy of for them contrast with that of larger corporations? Well, so the thing that I usually argue is that I think that it's a little bit wrong to think in terms of mid, small, or large corporations or like these different company sizes, because when you get into the practicality of things, there is so much overlap that I've never been able to distinguish between them. Well, let me put it this way. So if I work in a software team and I work in a very small company, well, that there will be some differences, and we are going to touch on those, of course. And if I work in a what we would call a mid-size or even a large corporation, there are some differences. But the day-to-day work, you're doing the stand-up, doing planning meetings and things like that. I have for my entire career never, not even for a single day, felt that there was a difference. None whatsoever. There are a few key things that we will touch on, but the day-to-day work, I think it's completely bullshit that there is this perfect correlation between that. If you work for a large corporation, the way that you do work on like these sorts of riches, that it's different, that you will feel some type of difference. And if you work in a small company, it will be very, very different. We of course have to sort of talk about what do we mean by small, because if it's a two-man operation or two people operation, well, of course, it's going to differ quite a lot. But I've worked at small startup guys where we've been just a handful of people, and we still had the exact same rituals, code reviews, like all the daily stuff that you do as a software developer. And it's, as I said, I have never felt the difference between that way of working and up all to to even up to the corporate sizes. The main difference that I usually say is not so much in the daily operations of things. It has more to do with the sort of issues that you face as a company and as a group of software developer. So in smaller companies, it is let's say more common, not always, but it's more common that you have to be open to a broader range of requirements. So if you're in a really, really smart startup, you might find yourself having to churn through quite a lot of various tasks that may or may not be to your liking. The same thing can be said for a big corporation, but in many cases here it is do or die, basically. In a small company, you're almost always scrambling for meeting deadlines and things like that. I'm going to touch on why I find it kind of funny that you have basically created the same situation in large corporations, which I think is hilarious, which is probably the biggest criticism I have to Scrum and sprints and agile work, not agile, but safe and so forth. But we're going to get to that. But for a small company, basically you're fighting to survive all the time, practically. And usually, as long as you really have your skills down and so forth, that doesn't bother you all that much, because you usually are able to meet those deadlines. Because as I've said before, guys, you can never be fast enough. It's not there is no one. I don't care how good you are, you will never be so fast that you will never miss, some requirement or some deadline, or not have a bug or something like that that you can fix so fast that nobody is ever unhappy with you. But you can be really, really good, and the goal is not to be so fast that you never have any issues. The goal is that on average you meet all the requirements. And sometimes, even if you are the best of the best, you're going to have to do overtime and things like that. In a large company, it's less likely that these sorts of things will happen. I'll touch on when it does happen. But for small companies, as I said, it's in many cases do or die, because you're in a very weak negotiation position until you get some type of stability within the organization. And there is also a very high chance that, well, not always, but I've found and honestly, it's one of the reasons why I'm more and more skeptical to working with startups, that you're going to work with people who work not as software developer, because usually the software developers who are in startups are kind of fun to work with, I've found at the very least, but it's the management and all the other people who are usually 20, 30 or almost 40 something person who's basically never had a serious gig before, and I just don't have the energy to deal with emotionally immature people anymore. I I really don't. I developed a bit of an intolerance towards, well, as you probably can expect, incompetence. And so usually when I have to work with small sized companies and so forth, it feels a little bit sometimes like a kindergarten where, as I've said, there is quite a lot of people, they're very hungry and it's a lot of fun, but a lot of the stuff that you can sort of depend on and sort of feel secure in, which you have from larger corporations, like that you have certain expectations you can put on your managers. They're not just going to come out of nowhere and start putting a bunch of demands on you and things like that. It's a little bit, let's call it relaxed sometimes. We'll talk about when that is no longer true. But that is honestly my biggest like difference, because the small companies, as I said, like for them it's mostly about survival, and the practical aspect of that is no different, because they can have, even if it's a small system, guys, they can have the most horrible infrastructure ever, because their customers that they are working with have set requirements that forces them into that situation. The exact same thing happens in big corporations. I promise you it does. Just because you work for a big corporate doesn't mean that you have like a lounge position where you can just use your favorite tools and you don't have any ugliness and you have all the time in the world to do things and so forth. That it's not doesn't work that way. Business is business, and business is chaotic, and technology, that's my measurement of true skill with in engineering, is that if you are truly good at what you do, the technology fits very well with the business requirements. If you're bad at what you do, the system is going to have problems adapting to the chaotic nature of business, because business is chaotic, in my opinion. So let's talk about the big corporates. So the big corporates, usually the thing that happens there is like there's more scale, more rituals, and more administration and bureaucracy around everything. Can happen in small companies as well if you have a lot of integrations and things like that. But my favorite one to complain about, and which most I think complain about in my sphere of the world and probably everywhere else, is dependencies. In large corporations, if you have to have a lot more meetings in many cases, depending on how many systems you have, can happen in the small ones again, but things take longer, you need more approvals, there are more rules, there are more everything takes usually a little bit longer, depending on the company, and depending on what type of practices that you have in the teams. So that's what I like to say about Scrum and Agile and things like that. So for a small company, they're basically forced into a situation where they have often quite a lot of deadlines in order to meet the expectations of their customers. And so what the big corporates have done, which I think it's hilarious, they've done exactly the same thing. They've used scrums and sprints and things like that to simulate the same problem. Now their customers of course have expectations and so forth and so forth as well, but you basically create the same sort of environment. So for a lot of for all intents and purposes, depending on the company you find yourself in, you might be exactly as stressed, as freaked out, as everything in a large corporation as you would in a small startup. The emotional toll it takes on you could be equal, and it's really down to that thing, as what I was saying, like depending on how the business operates and what type of people you have administrating and signing deals and stuff like that, you could be in the exact same situation. With one major difference, of course, is that there's more rituals and more process and stuff like that. Again, depending on the company, because these things are usually not exclusive to big or small companies. It depends on the people that you are working with. And so that's the thing that I usually think is probably the biggest differences. But honestly, if you really bend my arm, the daily operation stuff, I've worked in all sizes of companies and I've never really felt a major difference for the daily stuff. So what I want you to take away from this is that I would say that my experiences with all sizes of companies would be basically that the smaller you go, the more struggling to survive, the more things like more hacking and things like that you usually have to do because of necessity. The higher up you go, like the larger corporations, they may or may not have more time and so forth and so forth. There's more rituals, like you can basically think of it like small scale. Usually you're able to work a little bit more independently, if you're in the right situation. If you're in the wrong situation, you have exactly basically the same situation as you have as a large corporation. And conversely, if you are in a big corporation and you are a system, you're a single system that where you own all your own data and you have no integrations or external things or anything like that, then honestly guys, then I like that better than working in a startup or working, like, it really depends on the system and the infrastructure and like the business model and everything like that. That's the thing that dictates almost everything. In large corporations, usually you find more of people with more life experience and like things like that, which in many cases can be a very nice thing for people like myself who may or may not have felt in the past that when you're dealing with people who are still a little bit, I'm not saying younger, but people who are a little bit less emotionally secure and things like that, it's a little bit more fluctuation and things can like office politics and office culture and things like that have more of a presence in smaller companies, I've found, than in the larger corporates. You can still have that in large corporations because these things are not exclusive to any company. But as a general rule of thumb, I will tell you this: it doesn't really matter all that much in your daily operations if you're in a large corporation or in a small corporation, depending on the system. But in a worst case scenario, in a large corporation, everything is somebody else's job. Basically, you have no power to do anything, and everything is just sending tickets and like doing all of this bureaucracy that people love to hate on in meetings and stuff like that. And in a really small company, you have less of that, but at the same time, you can have a really stressful time working in a small company due to the fact that your customers are pushing you to do all these things that are hacky, short deadlines, and so forth and so forth. And yeah, it really is the luck of the draw where you're going to end up. These are just general trends, and none of them I've ever found to be definitively like a characteristic of big versus small. It really comes down to every specific case. And on average, honestly, it's, to me at the very least, not much difference in the daily stuff you do every single day. It's practically the same. Have a great day.